Now let's move into the final and often most decisive stage of witness evaluation, comparing a witness's account against all other available evidence. At this point, we're no longer just collecting statements, we're testing them. This is where investigators move from information gathering to proof assessment. In practice, this is often called checking for external consistency. In other words, does the story hold up when we compare it to everything else we know? The goal here is to determine the probative value of the testimony. That simply means, how strongly does this piece of information actually help prove or disprove what is being alleged? To do that, investigators rely on a wide range of independent evidence. First, we have documentary evidence. This includes things like emails, chat messages, HR records, attendance logs, and policy documents. These records are often extremely powerful because they create a time-stamped trail of what actually happened. For example, if a witness claims they were at a meeting during an incident, but badge swipe records show they were in a different building, that inconsistency is immediately significant. Then we have physical and forensic evidence. This is what we sometimes call real evidence, things you can touch, measure, or scientifically test. It might include physical objects, fingerprints, DNA, or other lab-based findings. Unlike memory, these forms of evidence don't change over time and are often decisive in confirming or rejecting a version of events. Next are digital footprints. Modern investigations rely heavily on digital data, CCTV footage, system logs, metadata, GPS traces, and even recovered deleted messages. These sources are particularly useful because they allow us to reconstruct timelines with a high degree of precision. They often reveal whether a witness's account aligns with what the systems actually recorded. We also compare other witness accounts. When multiple independent people describe the same event in similar ways, especially if they don't know each other, the reliability of the overall picture increases. On the other hand, if accounts diverge significantly, that becomes a signal that further analysis is required. Once all this information is gathered, the investigator begins the process of cross-referencing. This means checking statements against other interviews, earlier written reports, and objective records. A key question here is simple. Has the story changed over time, and if so, why? Another important tool is timeline analysis. By placing events in chronological order, investigators can visually map out what happened and when. This often makes inconsistencies stand out immediately: gaps, overlaps, or sequences that don't make sense under normal conditions. Where necessary, investigators also conduct site visits and reconstructions. These help test whether a witness's version of events is physically possible. For example, measuring distance, checking lighting conditions, and assessing visibility can determine whether someone could realistically identify a face from hundreds of feet away in low light conditions. When inconsistencies appear, the investigator has to understand why. This is where the harmony test comes in again. The question is whether the account fits with the overall preponderance of probabilities. In other words, whether a practical, informed person would see the story as reasonable given all the circumstances and evidence. To structure this analysis, investigators often separate evidence into two categories: facts that are not in dispute and facts that are in dispute. The agreed facts form the foundation. The disputed facts are where the real analysis happens. That's where evidence is weighed, tested, and ultimately reconciled. Another important issue is omissions and selective memory. Sometimes a witness forgets details that are genuinely lost over time. Other times, omissions may be more strategic, such as failing to mention information that could place them in a less favorable position. Investigators must be careful not to assume intent, but patterns of omission do matter. At this stage, investigators also have a responsibility to maintain procedural fairness. If new evidence contradicts a witness's statement, the witness must be given an opportunity to respond. The goal is not to trap anyone, but to test whether there is a reasonable explanation that reconciles the difference. When inconsistencies arise, investigators also consider motive. Does the person have a reason to misrepresent the facts? Are they protecting themselves? Are they reacting to a conflict, or is there no obvious incentive to distort the truth? Just as importantly, investigators must distinguish between a lie and an honest mistake. Not every inconsistency is intentional. Stress, memory limitations, trauma, and time all play a role in shaping how people recall events. A witness can be completely sincere and still be wrong. That's why objective evidence is essential for any defensible conclusion. Ultimately, all of this leads to the final decision point, the standard of proof. In most investigative contexts, that means asking whether, on balance, the evidence makes something more likely than not, often described as a preponderance of evidence. If the total body of corroborated evidence supports the allegation, a finding can be made. If the evidence remains evenly balanced and cannot be resolved through further testing, the appropriate outcome may be that the matter is unsubstantiated or inconclusive. The key point is this: witness testimony is never evaluated in isolation. It only gains meaning when it is tested against everything else. And it is this process of comparison, systematic, objective and evidence-driven, that ultimately allows investigators to move from stories to findings.